Mac ships. They're fun things. They really are. And like most of the really interesting ideas in World War II, there are absolutely dozens of people who claim that they were the originators of the idea. There's Captain Slattery of the Air Material Director of Air Material for the Admiralty, whose proposal was a follow-up to the CAM project. There is various teams in the naval constructors in the 1920s who are talking about how to deal with the fact that with the Washington Treaty in place, the British will not have enough carriers to secure their merchant fleets in the face of war, should they be dealing with an expansive convoy conflict. I know, it's amazing. It's almost as if someone was actually thinking about the realities of a possible war in World War II long before it happened. And of course, you can go back to HMS Argus and all sorts of things which are conversions. And there are all sorts of interesting points, because really, when you're looking at a Mac ship or you're looking at an escort carrier, the reason so many people can claim to have the idea is, let's see, what is the idea? It's a specific brand of converted merchant ship to fill a problem. When you've already got the idea floating around of converting merchant ships to provide aircraft carriers, going, oh, we can convert these ships, which we're using for already doing their convoys, and we can just attach a flight deck and hangar on top of them. It's not really earth-shattering. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. I mean, you've already got aircraft carriers, you've already got baby aircraft carriers, you've already got conversions in the world going, we are short of aircraft carriers. We have a big gap in the Atlantic we need to carry. These merchant ships are going backwards and forwards anyway. Let's make them into escort carriers or small carriers of some kind. It's not so much as having an idea as just working through the logic. It's solving a problem. But still, Mac ships are rather cool. They are rather cool because you basically take a bulk grain ship or an oil tanker, you add a flight deck and some sort of hangar facility on some of them, and they operate usually swordfish in support of convoys. They have both a mercantile status, i.e. they're civilian ships and continue to carry cargo and operate under civilian command, but they also have a naval force aboard. And they remained operational until the end of the war, and they're useful ships. They are force multipliers, because even with escort carriers, you start wanting to use them for other things. If you consider the escort carriers which go on to doing strike carrier duties and all sorts of other duties, most famously supporting the beaches of Salerno and all the operations taking place up the coast of Italy, and also operations in the Pacific, etc. Because the moment you have an escort carrier, it's a really useful ship, and you start thinking, well, yes, it's got a value escorting that convoy. It does. But wait for a minute, I have a small idea. You see, it's also a flight deck which can take some aircraft. And we really need a flight deck with some aircraft over there doing that. Oh, I see what you mean. So, is for the short duration of this operation, is that more useful than escorting a convoy? Whereas with Mac ships, that's never going to happen, because they are merchant ships. They can only carry a very limited number of aircraft, and I mean a piddling number of aircraft, so you aren't going to do that. But they also have another advantage in their operations. In fact, that's sort of made entirely possible by some of the decisions the British pursued with their aircraft design. Let's be honest, the Swordfish, spec 1933, entered service 1936. It is absolutely amazing for small ship operations. Yes, you can use rocket-assisted takeoff to get it to take off with really heavy loads from a Mac ship, but they can often take off from a Mac ship without any help. It works. It does. There are, I have to say, lots of options for how this could have worked out. It could have been absolutely terrible. I mean, again, let's think about this. You are adapting ships which are supposed to be unloaded, especially the grain bulk ships. And they've got to be unloaded quite quickly, because grain is one of those perishable items. You don't want it in the ship any longer than it has to be. And you are putting a flight deck on top of it. None of that is a flight deck which is going to have aircraft which notoriously have a habit of, when they're damaged, stressed, or strained in any way, shape, or form, like to leak oil. Let's be honest, the aircraft in World War II, the vast majority of them, are about one bad hair day. I'm talking from the aircraft's perspective, so probably bad, I don't know, bad propeller day? I'm trying to figure it out here. Away from leaking oil everywhere. They will do it. Over grain, that's not so good. But there again, quite a lot of these ships were oil tankers and were often carrying aviation fuel. Which meant that theoretically they had a disturbingly high capability of aircraft operations. Because if you think about it, if you're loaded fully with aviation fuel and you're operating about 6 aircraft and you're carrying several thousand tons of aviation fuel, there's never going to be a question of, do we have enough fuel to do this operation? Oh, I'm not sure. Could we still bath all the swordfish in fuel? Yes. Good. Then you can do the operation. Troubles Matters Daring. Yeah, it's the book I've got out for sale at the moment. Its second edition is out, and currently I've got a competition running on this channel where you can win. There are 2 copies up to 1. For a very nice little short essay writing competition. There's a link to it down below. Please go have a look at it. It's a cool competition, and there's some really cool judges involved. Really cool judges. And yes, I'm in a new shirt. I'm back from the gym, and believe it or not, the same shirt I wear to the gym is not the shirt I wear after the gym. It's better that way. So, Mac ships. Mac ships. Well, honestly, when I'm talking about Mac ships and the design, I do go to some pretty old books. Most of the current books, when they discuss Mac ships, are, how do I put this, very focused on the military function, the naval function, the warfighting function, and the stories of the swordfish which flew off them. And even then, finding actually a decent book about them, which literally focuses on the Mac ships, is a pretty interesting task. Honestly, you're left with mostly National Archives search, and there's various books about escort carriers, and the Mac ships are tagged into that. And I find that sad. Let's put it this way. Mac ships are on my list of books. Once I start getting my self-publishing going and it's got to the point where it's funding itself as it's going on, rather than waiting for me to have money and time and not be moving house or things like that, then Mac ships are definitely going to get their own work. Because you have so many interesting stories about them. I already started off with one of the stories about their creation. There is another one, and it's in this book itself. It's written, it's in the written contributions to the discussion by Sir Amos Eyre, KBE, that's Knight of the British Empire, Vice President of the Royal Institute of Naval Architects. Sorry. Took me a while to remember that one. It is difficult to say with certainty from whom came the idea of the merchant aircraft carrier, but I remember the first suggestion made to me was from Sir Douglas Thompson, BT. Then Parliamentary Private Secretary, Ministry of War Transport, who had been working on the idea with some of his colleagues in the ministry. It was made at a moment when, at the highest level, the most serious consideration was being given to the question of using certain merchant shipbuilding capacity, either for the continuance of building of merchant ships or for the smaller type of aircraft carrier, for each of which we had the most dire need. The Mac ship was a means to meeting both requirements. What is fun is in this article, which is written by one person, but of course, as is tradition with any of the transactions, has a whole load of contributions from various people in here, is you actually have multiple sources described. There are discussions about meetings and multiple meetings within the Admiralty discussing, lots of ministers and lots of naval officers and constructors getting together and talking about things. You've got various politicians, various members of the civilian world and the mercantile world getting together having similar ideas. And I think, to be honest, this book, far more than any other work, which is it tends to, most works I've read, when they do have them, tend to try and find one person who you can ascribe it to, really does illustrate to me the reality of the Mac ship. We have a problem. This is a very obvious solution. There are lots of people who have the idea of the obvious solution, but actually implementing it is a different thing. And one of the interesting things when you start to look at some of the earlier plans, the British especially had, was they had a rather similar idea to what the Japanese had, which was that you would have merchant ships which had been funded so that they had been pre-built with the idea of being rapidly converted into escort carriers. Now, the difference between probably the British idea for it and the Japanese idea for it is the British very much realised that they are unlikely to be able to get any carriers that fulfill the cruiser carrier role. I've talked about this in the British Naval Aviation Doctrine video, which came out on Tuesday the 30th of January 2024. And realistically, the idea was that you would have cruiser carriers who would do the escort carrying role and the reconnaissance role and the supporting cruisers on their operations and providing with them with airborne support and overwatch, because the Royal Navy really didn't like the idea of stopping ships in waters. The Royal Navy, again, are World War II, and I say this in many videos, but I have to sometimes say this in videos again and again, so you might hear this multiple times, but if this is the first video you're watching, it's the first time you've heard this, have suffered a series of traumas in World War I that they are exercising, or excising in a way, in World War II. And one of those is Albuquerque, Cressy, and Hogue, the sinking of those 3 armoured cruisers. That meant the Royal Navy absolutely hated the concept of stopping, hated the concept of going in a straight line, and hated the concept of, well, actually had this concept that there was always a submarine lurking. So this is why when people start doing analysis of them versus, let's say, the British cruiser operations versus American cruiser operations, and people point to things like Tassafaronga, it can sound quite cruel to the Americans when you go, well, the British would not have been caught out by the long-range torpedo strike. It's not because the British had any better intelligence over the Japanese torpedoes than the Americans really did. They did have some, but they didn't have it. It was good better in some ways, worse in others. So it's basically half a dozen one, 60 other. Basically, neither side has put their intelligence pictures together. So that would have probably helped them. It might have given them a 75% idea. But leaving that to one side, the British would have been zigzagging. Not because of long-range torpedoes, but because they're definitely afraid of submarines. And they believe they're lurking everywhere. They always act like they're lurking everywhere. So that would have meant that they would have been far more difficult to predict and launch a long-range torpedo strike on and actually hit anything, because they would have all been zigzagging, which enters in course variations, timing variations, all sorts of issues, into lining up such a long-range torpedo strike. And those things are a factor in the Royal Navy's thinking, and it's got this idea of these smaller carriers, and that's why it's had Hermes, that's why it had Argus still wandering around doing various duties. The thing is, though, the Royal Navy is also signed up by the British government to the Washington Naval Treaty and then the London Naval Treaties, and that gives you a cumulative limit on total tonnage of your force of 135,000 tons. And the British know they're going to need at least 6 fleet carriers to guarantee they have availability for the various roles they want those carriers for. Frigate. And whilst you're allowed up to 27,000 tons to build an individual carrier, the fact is, if you on 135,000 tons, that only gives you 5. This is why the British are looking at 23 and 22,000 ton ships, so they can get 6 from 135,000 tons. But that means you're definitely not going to have any cruiser carriers. Now, for the reconnaissance role, they think, well, for cruisers out on their own, they're in the Middle Atlantic, they can launch and maybe recover their aircraft. They will try and go with that, at least at the beginning of the war, and until they can actually get something into service. There are ideas for rapid construction, and there is also things like HMS Unicorn, which they're working on, which is, of course, a forward aviation support ship. Not an aircraft carrier, forward aviation support ship, but let's be honest, by its very definition, because it's supposed to be able to go into support operations, it can also self-support in areas which have very limited logistical support, very limited infrastructure support aviation operations. So basically that's if they had carried on building and ordering and building one of those a year, which is pretty much what they were planning on, sort of ordering one a year for until 1942. And there was a debate over whether it was going to be 1, then 2, then 1, or what it was, because they didn't count towards the tonnage. Those would have probably been used to fulfill the cruiser role in cruiser carrier role in certain areas. But what about escorting convoys? Okay, well this is where the British have the idea of maybe we have some merchant ships which we have already picked out that we can modify quickly when war begins. Unfortunately for the British, unlike Japan, A, this idea has to get past the Treasury, B, it has to get past the Cabinet, and C, it has to get past the, oh, is this so lovely we're going to leak it to the press test. And the Cabinet doesn't feel it's in the spirit of the Washington or London naval treaties, which they've signed up to and wholeheartedly believe that the 14-inch guns and other things are going to create peace in our time by virtually unilaterally disarming, because we're the only country following it. By the end of it, it's going to create peace in our time. It's unilateral disarmament has always made such good methods of peace. The Treasury, who, whilst the 10-year rule is abandoned in 1932, hold off on actually releasing the purse strings till 1937, and even then it's basically post-Inskip Award and with a lot of very nasty people, including members of the royal family and senior members in the House of Lords, staring at them very hard, that they start to realise this might not be a good idea. And we're talking about a different period. You have to remember, even to this day, members of the House of Lords have sort of, I would say they've not got the same influence they used to have in many regards, but the House of Lords in this period, the major included quite a lot of the lords who were often major landowners, but also usually fairly rich, and more importantly were often politically neutral or loosely aligned with a political party, but only in so much as that's one we usually agree with, not one we actually will always go with. And they're sufficiently independent and sufficiently loud, they can cause you trouble if you're the Treasury. There are other people you can have far more fun playing games with than those particular members of the House of Lords at that time. And leaving that all sort of to one side, so they've finally got money coming in, that hasn't given them time to implement any sort of real policy. So you've had ideas about converting merchant ships and having maybe ships designed to be converted to merchant into such escort carriers going around for, well, I would say when Admiral Madden is first Sea Lord, that's when I first find documents which are heading in that direction. In that they're not called that, but they are discussing that. And that's, again, one of the things you have to sometimes consider, that Sometimes the names things will start out with are very different from the names they end up, and it's auxiliary merchant aviation support and various other phrases around that appear. So, Mac ships. What are they about? Well, they're about providing 4 swordfish where you need them the most. And think about that, 4 swordfish. Why 4? Why is that the critical figure? Why aren't they 3 or 6 or 8? Surely more is better. Well, you're right, more is better, but 4 is the bare minimum. 4 guarantees you an aircraft in the air and an aircraft available to launch. There is a reason we have the UK and France both operate a 4-boat ballistic missile submarine deterrent. Submarine-based ballistic missile deterrents. The reason they have 4 boats for those duties. Why? Guarantees 1 at sea. 1 available to go to sea if you need to. 1 probably in long-term refit. 1 in other refit. Short-term or training. Various things. Guarantees 1 at sea. 4 aircraft, guarantee 1 in the air. And that's the important thing. And 1 ready to go in the air. It's what you need. And as it's the bare minimum, then you can design it to take up the bare minimum of space, the bare minimum of crew, the bare minimum of everything. Which makes it the easiest to adapt a ship to. So if we look at the MV Empire MacAndrew here, which is a lovely example of the Mac type. She was operated by the Haynes Steamship Company Limited of St Ives, Cornwall. She's not a naval ship. Critical factor, and one you really do read when you start to go through proper books about this, is that, of course, these were merchant ships. Their crews were merchant. They had naval personnel attached to them, and I'm going to keep emphasizing this, but they are merchant ships. The naval crews are purely for operation of the aircraft. So literally, you could look at this design and go, oh, that below is a grain carrier. That's all for grain. That above, there is a hangar in there. There is all the stuff you need to support your aircraft in there. There are actually delays. There are delays. Getting the Mac ships into service, because there's delays getting things like arrestor cables and other systems which are used to support aircraft operations. But they get them into service. And one of the really, truly interesting things about them, is the differences in their style of operations, because we've got the Empire MacAndrew here. Now, she's one of the first group. We're just 6 strong. There's 6 vessels. They are equipped with a hangar and a lift. They also have a 4-inch quick-firing gun, 2 single 40mm Bofors, and 4 single 20mm cannon. They have a top speed of 12 knots. And I would say McAlpine and McKendrick are the only 2 not operated by Haynes. They're operated by Benline steamers, and they're good ships. Benline steamers is based in Scotland, of course. Now, if we go over here, you can really see the difference in them. You can see the difference of the hangar space, especially if I expand out. In contrast, on this side is some designs of what were the 12 oil tankers, which were the last 12 ships. There is a group in the middle, but what is important to realise is that whilst this group, the first 6, had a hangar, had facilities to support aircraft, the rest did not. And the designs really do show this. It shows, to my mind, what was still built with, or rather modified with some eye to what have been the 1920s, 30s concepts, discussions going on about the ships and about what they could be. And in contrast, the Rapana, the 12 oil tankers, they are built to be as quick conversions as viable oil tankers as they possibly can be. Honestly, the first batch of Mac ships are probably closer in capabilities in terms of operational capabilities of maintaining operation in certain circumstances to escort carriers. Whereas the remainder Mac ships are... You'll maintain those operations, but you are going to wear your crew down. You're going to wear them down greatly, and you're going to make their life a lot more difficult. Maintaining aircraft on deck in the North Atlantic, etc., is not a good scenario, and it does cause issues. Now, as said, the first ones, they were operated by two companies. Mostly the Haynes Steamship Company, but two by Benline Steam as well. When it comes to the McCall, the McCabe, and I think the McMahon, they are operated by the British Tanker Company, which is the maritime transport sort of arm of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which of course is BP today. Empire Mackay, she was operated by Anglo-Saxon Petroleum. Another fun company that is a sort of subsidiary nowadays of Shell. I think it's Shell it's a subsidiary of. I'm not sure if it's been completely subsumed into Shell or is still operating. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm interested in the ships in the 1940s and this era. Who owns the modern ships is often a joy of Shell game to try and track down of which company is real versus which one is on paper. And I have neither the life nor the level of boredom that I've reached or the level of time on my hands that I am twiddling my thumbs to be inclined to go and hunt that down about the modern companies. So I think they are owned by Shell. I think they are still operated, but I'm not sure. These vessels, well, interesting enough, they are 1,000 tons heavier at deep load. They require an extra 15 crew. But they can only do 11 knots rather than 12. And they only carry 4 aircraft, sometimes 3. Sometimes that number of aircraft is decided by the sea, not by the aircraft loaded on her. Armament was again a single 4-inch gun. But no 40mm this time, just 8 20mm cannon. They have an interesting career. The McCall, she is built by Camel Laird's, Birkenhead. Laird and Son Company, as it was at the time. Under orders from the Ministry of War Transport. She is eventually scrapped at Faslane in 1962 after being renamed British Pilot and serving as an oil tanker from 1946 onwards. So she spends 16 years plying the world as an oil tanker after World War II. Just a pure oil tanker. And honestly, if we go back to this, that's not exactly a difficult conversion, is it? You can literally just rip the top off. And you don't even really have to worry about that if you don't want to, but you can. Make life easier if you make yourself be a slightly more conventional looking ship. Might. Then we have some of the other new builds, and this design is, to my mind, reading through the book, is more to be associated with that of the McCall, the Empire ones. I think it fits them more than the Rapina and the Class of 12 that come afterwards. It fits their designing, their shaping, and how they are orientated. Because again, if you look at this design and you look at this shaping, there are similars to the flow. There are similarities to it. What I liked about this, and this of course all comes from this book, these all come from these books, is that the amount of descriptive detail you have about the upper bridge and the bridge deck and how you have things arranged for personnel in terms of their accommodation space and their operation. It was an interesting vessel. Often these ships were used on the North American convoys, or on the convoys between North America and the UK, or Halifax and Liverpool. And so most of them, what happens is they'd come out of their construction, they'd be finished, and they'd pretty much go straight off onto a convoy. They would get very little in the way of warm-up and training time because, honestly, there isn't much there to train up. Yes, the merchant ship's crews had to have a concept of how they were going to operate with the aircraft. But in many ways that was done as here, have a discussion, this is the theory, good luck, and there are going to be some Fleet Air Arm types aboard, and they'll tell you what they need help with. Which you can imagine made people like the landing officer and all sorts of things incredibly important, because they had to communicate both what the pilot needed to know about the ship, how it was maneuvering when they were coming to land, but also needed to communicate what the captain needed to understand about the aircraft coming into land, often to someone who didn't have an idea or even a Scooby on what it was like or what they were dealing with. And here is the MV Rapana, which were the class of 12, and this class matters because if we consider the grain carriers, there were 6 of them. The new build oil tankers, there were 4 of them, and then the triple 12s, well, as said, were the largest class, were the largest single group. Although there weren't 12 of them, there really weren't. In fact, there was merely 9. They were called the triple 12s because they had a deadweight tonnage of 12,000 tons. They each consumed roughly 12 tons of fuel per day and had a speed of 12 knots. That's at least where it's supposed to come from. But they had a really different career because MV Aculus operated squadrons from O Flight of 860 Naval Air Squadron. MV Gedalier operated under a Dutch registry with the Swordfish of S Flight 860 Naval Air Squadron. And MV Makona operated under a Dutch registry with the later F Flight of 860 Naval Air Squadron. 860 Naval Air Squadron doing a lot of work here. Amastra and Ankylos actually ceased operating of Swordfish in 1944. They instead used their decks for ferrying aircraft to and from the US. Mainly from the US to the UK, but occasionally they took things back as well. Other than the 2 ships operating under Dutch registry, all the rest were operated by the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company. Hooray for them. And again, they're armed with a single 4-inch gun. These get those 2 40mm Bofors again, and they have 6 20mm Oricon cannons, which means they are probably the heaviest armed. And they have a crew of 118. 64 Royal Navy to operate the air group of 4 Swordfish, and 54 Merchant Navy. They ended service between July 1943 and May 1944, but again, when you look at these ships, you're sitting there going, why couldn't you have a hangar? And basically the entire reason they are built as they are, and the entire reason they are built as they are, is speed of construction, because it was found sticking in the hangar, the lift, all these things, created so many more difficulties. So many more difficulties. If you don't have them, you don't have to do anything about them. You don't have to worry about their weight. You don't have to worry about their operation. You don't have to worry about their maintenance. You don't have to worry about any of that. It works. So, were they useful? Were they any good? What did they do? Well, they literally do what they're supposed to do. They sail backwards and forwards with the convoys they're assigned, and they provide overwatch. Some convoys have full-blown escort carriers. Some have Mac ships. Some sometimes have both. And basically their entire purpose is to maintain that overwatch, close the aerial gap over the Atlantic, and keep the flow of trade, the flow of supplies, the flow of logistics, the flow of all the stuff you need going. Isn't that good? It's again one of the interesting factors that comes into a lot of discussions when we start talking about World War II, and there are people talking about the various German Wunderwaffen which were going to come into service, and they're talking about the new submarines and going, well, when they came into service, the Royal Navy, it would have been in terrible trouble. All those convoys would be in terrible trouble. And you sit there and go, is the submarine faster than the aircraft? If not, it's got an issue. Okay, yes, it's going to be the best at attacking from underwater. But that means it's depending on its torpedoes to do its job, and it carries far less of them than it does shells. So that's going to limit it. Secondly, are those aircraft going to be armed with surface search radar? If they do have the ASV radar put aboard, well, that means they can probably see the periscope. That's not a good position. And finally, there is the fact that the submarines have to find their target and move to engage them. The convoys, which are escorted by Mac ships, escort carriers, whatever in their number, do not have to find themselves. Those aircraft know exactly where they are, and they're flying around their convoy. That makes life very difficult. It's not a panacea. It's not. But it's the reason why the solutions come in when they do. The reason the British start pushing down this route really in 1941-42, and really start pushing down a lot of routes in 1940 to 41, is because they know the submarines are coming. They know the submarines are going to be a threat. They can read the intelligence tea leaves as well as anyone else. And they also know what they can hold that threat at bay. You see, today, whenever we talk about warfare, we have almost a computer game, Cold War approach to it. The thing that matters is the kill. The thing that matters is how many of those have you destroyed. It's kind of like a post-Vietnam scenario where they used to post a number of people dying on the nightly news and things like that. Whereas in World War II, they also have a mission success protocol. Mission success for a convoy is getting the convoy through. It doesn't matter if you kill the enemy or not. If you never encounter the enemy while you're at sea, that's a great convoy. So how do you stop submarines attacking? You force them underwater. In this period, you force them underwater. It makes them a lot slower to maneuver around. It puts them on a timer in terms of their oxygen. And it means they have far more limited attack capabilities because of the fact they are dependent upon their torpedoes, which they carry far fewer of. And yes, they are ultimately very dangerous submarines with torpedoes, but again, they carry a lot fewer of those than they do gun rounds. So you force that submarine underwater, you have won half the battle. You have dictated the battle to them. And yes, the later submarines were designed to try and take back control of that battle, but the problem is at that point they're dealing with a huge proliferation of these vessels, of escort carriers, all sorts of things. And the same criteria which shifts escort carriers off to be strike carriers can shift escort carriers back from being strike carriers to being escort carriers. Which is the most important at the moment? Which is the critical? Which is the thing which is going to decide the outcome of the war soonest? The moment it becomes our convoys are under attack, it will become we have a lot more escort carriers available. And that's really the whole thing. It's a case of anti-submarine warfare at this point has got into a tech competition by this point in the war. And that tech, of course, is between the hunters and the hunted. But who is the hunter and who's the hunted switches sides, depending on the tech balance. It really does. And so, Mac ships. What's the question that comes with them? Well, I like a Mac ship. I really do. But the more and more I thought about these vessels, the more and more I thought about their convoys, their duties, their careers. I also thought about things like the Atlantic Conveyor in 1982 in the Falklands War. And well, these are one step ahead of that because they're really designed to take off and land and operate from them. Although I would probably massively prefer the first batch to operate from. So, here's the thing. These days we're even less prepared. The world is, let's be honest, probably even less prepared for the concepts of high-intensity warfare at sea. There are a lot of fun discussions going around and various points made about the survivability of aircraft carriers. I don't really agree with them, but there again, there are some points which are made which are worthwhile addressing. One of the ones which is often levelled at modern aircraft carriers is that they're so big, they have so many crew, that losing them is a national disaster, so therefore you can't risk them. And that's a problem. That's a problem because you end up spiraling into a whole scenario of, well, if you can't risk that many crew, what is an acceptable number of personnel you can risk? Which, put another way, is how many people do you mind dying? How many people are you prepared to write off? And if a carrier is being risked, it's being risked for the value it brings to the force. The strike, the air defense, the reach, all the systems it brings to that task group that it is the centerpiece of, and it is part of that group, that's why you have the carrier there. So if you no longer feel comfortable risking the carrier to do that role, what is going to replace it in that role? Is it as reliable? One of the interesting debates we have currently going on, of course, with VLS systems is whether or not you can resupply them at sea. There were systems in the early days. They are not really viable for current operations, and they don't really have any answer to how to fix that problem currently. There's lots of people working on interesting ideas, but it's not happened. But you can resupply an aircraft carrier at sea. You can rearm its aircraft at sea. That's basically the entire job of an aircraft carrier. One can say it's an entire auxiliary ship there to rearm and resupply its aircraft and keep them up in the air. So, yeah, that makes them actually probably one of the most survivable in some ways ships. There are still issues with that. There are issues. It's not an easy subject. And anyone coming up with easy answers is probably wrong. I'd also say that once you go down the route of trying to work out what is a viable amount of life you're prepared to risk or you are basically happy with losing, very quickly the answer becomes zero, at which point there is no point in having any armed forces at all, because the very nature of armed forces is to risk that things can go wrong and you might lose those people. It's a sad reality. It's nothing anyone wants to go into, but it's the truth. You have armed forces, you use them, they are carrying a risk. They have a risk. The enemy gets a vote. But more importantly, I would perhaps argue if these assets are so valuable and so critical to operations we want to use them, but so valuable we can't dare use them because of losing them is such a big problem, then rather like housing stocks in many countries where the house price is going far too high for most people to afford them, you probably need to build more. Again, that can sound terrible, but let's consider it. If you have more of those ships, more aircraft carriers, aviation ships, or variations on Mac ships, and I'll get to the question in a second, if you have more, then the loss of one is far less of a significant strategic impact in terms of the ship. Losing the crew is still not going to be good. Losing that crew, if you lose all of them, that's tremendously terrible. But again, with modern systems on most ships and their ability to damage control and survive, taking hits, and even if they don't stay afloat permanently, to actually stay afloat long enough for the crew to disembark, you could actually find most of the crew survive. That's another interesting thing. The amount of people who, when they pose that question of the value of aircraft, presume that the entire crew are going to get wiped out, that any weapon that hits is going to wipe them out. I don't think most carriers are going to be... They could be golden BB'd. All ships can be potentially golden BB'd, i.e. one shot just manages to find a supercritical spot and hits it in just the right way. But the odds are it's going to be multiple hits, and the odds are it's going to be a cumulative thing, because more ships are lost through fire than anything else, and that usually takes time to sink a ship. Again, the Falklands War is an interesting model to look at for this case. The number of ships lost by the British versus the number of full ships' crews lost by the British. The latter doesn't happen. So, yeah. There are those things to debate and discuss. And realistically, it is an issue. It is something we have to think about. Which brings me to, well, we need more aircraft carriers. What about a modern Mac ship? Should nations be looking at their merchant ship fleets and trying to encourage national flags, companies which flag their ships as are owned by within that nation, national operators sort of thing, flag some of their ships and go, we'd like those to be able to be rapidly converted. Or maybe something like the Point class for the British, in terms of a government-owned, in many ways, transport firm, which are used to move supplies around the world to support the British Armed Forces, etc. They're useful ships. Perhaps some ships like that should be owned by the British government in peacetime. That in peacetime are normal merchant vessels putting out to tender for contracts, carrying goods backwards and forwards. And in wartime, they could be used for moving goods, if necessary, to support operations, or they could be maybe rapidly converted by some means into a modern Mac ship. And I'll even go so far as to say what I think a modern Mac ship would be. I don't think it's going to be operating F-35s. I'd love that, but I don't think so. I think it will need some form of containerized air defense systems to be added to it. Close-in weapon systems, and probably a point defense missile system, because it's going to be a valuable target. I think it would need to be able to operate helicopters. I think anti-submarine warfare helicopters, both of the crewed and the uncrewed variety. I would recommend at least 4 crewed, and if there can be uncrewed that do not take up that much space, but are still viable and useful, then probably about 8 of those. I think it would need some sort of hangar arrangement for them, but again, if you're operating helicopters, it doesn't need a lift, it doesn't need all those facilities, it doesn't even need to be all built along the full length of the full length of the hull. You can take over a section, you can put in a prefabricated hangar, you can put in a prefabricated flight deck that you can slot in, that's already available. And before people start sort of thinking, well, Alex, these things aren't right, have a look at some of the British Bay class vessels when they've been operating recently. A fair number of them, because they weren't built with hangars, have operated with what are sometimes referred to as makeshift hangars, but are temporary hangars which have been attached onto the ship. The facility exists. What I'm suggesting is that you need to have the vessels highlighted and assure they're available, and sure you can get to them, and have the equipment for the rapid conversions sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Just sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Preferably somewhere secure. That's not an impossible feat. I'd like your opinion on that. I'd like your ideas, whether you think that's a sensible idea. Whether you think we should just go straight for building the full-size fleet carriers and just building more of them and all the other ships we need. I'd love to see that. But getting the level of funding and commitment out of government seems to be beyond possible at the moment. It often strikes me that we're in a period of 1920s and 30s. There are a lot of growing, threatening personalities around who are gambling, and I say this always, gambling, that they can bluff their way to more power. And the lesson from the 1930s was that actually going for a moderate rearmament and trying to appease those people and trying to negotiate didn't actually get peace in the end. It made things worse. Because it made them believe that you weren't actually going to fight them. Let's be honest, one of the reasons why Mussolini joins World War II, which makes the war far, far more difficult, is that he thought that France was going to crumble quickly and the British would then sue for peace, and he wanted to be part of that peace treaty. He wanted to get his share of the spoils. Italy wasn't prepared for war. That didn't bother him, though. He joined the war because he wanted his share of the spoils. And that made World War II far, far more complicated. Far, far more complicated. It's very different fighting a war against just Germany than fighting a war against Germany and Italy than fighting a war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. And it's all based on their assumptions looking at the forces they're facing. They're looking at the announcements of the governments. They're looking at how they've been funding defense. They're looking at how they've been procuring. They're looking at their depth of reserves. And if they considered the reserves light in World War II, goodness knows what they would consider the reserves today. And they are good, solid people. I've done a lot of work with various branches of reserves in the UK over last years of my adulthood, and they are very good, very hard-working people. I've met reservists from many other countries as well. I've been lucky to do so, NATO and across it. And they are good, hard-working people, but there aren't that many of them. And it's very rare they have whole ships, let alone whole units themselves. They're often used to plug gaps. Anyway. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've enjoyed. And I hope you enjoyed the question. And what have we got coming on next week? We have got, well, some more pictures. Some more pictures of Mac ships, which I thought you might enjoy. Again, they come from the book. Again, they show the various things going on. Grain being disembarked. They show them as they're converted before conversion in Rapana. And after its conversion, if you go back to here, this is a Rapana after conversion. The one at the bottom is it before conversion, and of course the one in the middle is it after, after conversion. They even have lifeboats. Again, this is one of the scenarios I find most interesting, is that the idea seems to often strike people when they're talking about the concepts to do with carriers and modern carrier warfare. They think these things are going to be taken out in one swift blow. And there's a chance. But what's the likelihood chance that? Honestly, for most scenarios where that becomes a possibility, you're using nuclear weapons. And if you're already using nuclear weapons in that scenario, you are not long away from a general nuclear exchange. You start using nuclear weapons to wipe out carrier battle groups, you're not far off a general exchange. You don't want to go down that route. But again, you're dealing with gamblers. If they think they can get away with it, if they think they can do it, they might. Sadly, a lot of warfare, a lot of strategy is about psychology. It's about the image. Not the reality necessarily, the image of the reality. And you can't control what your enemy perceives. You can only control what image you deliver. You can't control what people see of you in the street. You can only control the image you deliver. I like to wear t-shirts at home. I like to be comfortable when I'm talking on these videos. But when I go and do TV work, I'm suited and booted. I have I put smart trousers, jacket, smart shoes, usually a long sleeve button shirt, those things. When I've been going around houses, and you've seen this in the videos for the Jack Speak videos, I'm often the same. I'm smart shirt. Not quite smart jacket, but smartish jacket. Definitely smart casual on the side of the jacket. And again, suited and booted. Why? Because I found when I'm filming on my own in the middle of the next to a beach or somewhere, if I don't want to get interrupted by people, if I look smart, they don't come up to me. They don't disturb me as much. And that makes it a lot quicker. I like chatting with people, but I also like getting the videos recorded quickly, and efficiently. So I do it that way, because then I can usually go get some food. And the reason I'm suited and booted when I go onto a television screen is because, whereas on YouTube it's an audience choosing to come here for the topic, and to an extent they're going to hopefully tolerate me because me being more comfortable because they enjoy the topic. The people on the television screen get no choice about me. They don't get to go, we like the sound of him, we don't like the sound of him. I'm part of the TV company selection and their production. So I need to look appropriate and look like my academic self so that I fit what the company's projecting. So I hopefully am acceptable to the TV audience. Now, that's all about acceptability, but it's the same when you want to project an image of strength, when you want to project an image of security. The small, tiny person in the corner could be the world's best martial artist. They could be. But if people don't know that about them, and they see them, and they see a great big hulking, huge mountain of a person next to them, the one the people are going to be worried about is the mountain. That's the one they're going to take a bit of a look at. Again, you could be looking at an absolute amazing ninja walking around in plain clothes, or in medieval period, or someone who's in full plate armor. Which one are you going to be more worried about? They're probably both skilled warriors, but one's a visible skill and has got the armor to prove it, and it looks stronger. Looking strong helps. It really does. So coming up, we have the pre-World War I naval aviation, what the various countries were doing. So that's going to be a fun one. That is going to be a fun one on the 6th of February. We've got after that, on the 13th, we've got the conception, operation and conclusion of the Europa and Giuseppe Maraglia, which are the Regia Marinas, seaplane carriers. I wanted to do those early in the year because, honestly, they have a lot of interesting ideas and explain a lot of what happens with things. And the US Navy Aircraft Squadron System, hopefully the book arrives in time. There's a new book out which is supposed to be good about it, and I don't want to do the video based on the old books. If there's a good new book which has got a good stuff in it, I want to have the new book as well. It's supposed to be arriving on time. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Oh, and I forgot to do this on a recent video, and YouTube started nagging me again. So if you like the videos, please maybe share. subscribe to see more. And if you want to support the channel, please, there's Patreon, there's Ko-fi, and there's memberships of the channel. I have various systems set up for different people's desires. Patreon get to suggest topics and vote on topics for the monthly lives. Members get cool emojis and get to do all sorts of things in the chat, really, although not all of them seem to take advantage of it when we're live. And Ko-fi, well, that buys me some iron brew, which I pretty much run on, especially at the moment. It's what I find time for. Stress relief and caffeine in one. It's brilliant. Thank you very much, Aaron. Take care and have a nice evening.